Are the knife fights in Dune any good? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. For any of you who don't know me, I'm a martial arts and fencing instructor. I'm also an antique sword dealer as well. Now, while I mostly focus on swords, I do also dabble in the world of historical and modern knife dueling. So that makes me kind of somewhat qualified, not the most in the world, I'm not claiming to be, but somewhat qualified to have a look and see what I think of the fights in Dune. So in this video we're going to look at two main duels. Now the first thing I want to say is most of the knife work that is seen in the movies, both 1 and 2 of Dune, are to some extent very dramatized and theatrical. There are things in there that you wouldn't necessarily teach a person to do, advise a person to do, or expect a person to do in a real knife duel. What am I talking about knife duels? Well, obviously I mostly deal with swords, but knife duels absolutely were a thing historically, and therefore when I study historical European martial arts, we look at treatises and manuals, whether it's from World War II, the likes of Biddle, or going all the way back to things like Fiore de Liberi's use of daggers, or Tauhofer, or various other sources, right the way through Marozzo, George Silver. Loads of different people over the centuries have advised how to use weapons, and those sometimes include knives. And in fact, in the Wild West in the 19th century, there were probably more knife duels than shootouts. Now what we actually see in Dune is heavily based on Kali, Eskrima, Filipino martial arts, FMA for short. So Filipino martial arts are one of the most developed, most complex, and to be honest, most legit forms of learning to use knives and shorter blades. So generally speaking, there are lots of different fencing and sword systems in the world to study. There aren't actually a huge number of knife systems. We've got Filipino ones, we've got lots of European ones, we've got certain African and other Asian systems that we could look at as well, South American, kind of Latin America as well, and Spain and Southern Italy. So there are various places that have existing knife traditions, and people like me study some of these for fun, not for anything offensive, just for fun, just like fencing, and we spar, okay? So my interpretations of what I see on screen here, my experience such that it is, my opinions, take them or leave them, but they are mine, and I'm going to give you what I think about these fights as we see them in Dune. So the first thing to say is the fights that we're going to look at primarily here aren't the training fight. Okay, now in the training fight they talk about the armor, that is the kind of force field, and the slow blade penetrate. So everybody knows that about Dune, whether you've seen the original 1980s one or the more recent ones from the 2020s. The fact is we're not going to be looking at fights which involve that type of armour. So put all of that stuff aside. So this is purely about the use of a knife against people who don't have energy fields around them. A very, very important difference, because that would lead to a different fighting style. But there's a very important factor here which goes through both of these fights, and I'm going to mention therefore straight at the start. And that is, in both cases, the people are wearing clothing and or essentially light armor. Now this massively affects the way that you would historically, or in a sci-fi setting, use the knife. You would primarily be looking to use the point, not the edge. However, because they've used Filipino martial arts as the basis for their choreography, and it is very much choreography, it's like a dance and the actors are going through a set of moves, there are a lot of cuts in there. That is, slashes, okay, cuts with the edge. I do have a fundamental problem with this, because it's not the logical way of using a knife historically, and we can look at all of those historical sources. It's not the logical way of using a knife or dagger against people who are wearing thick clothing, winter clothing, or certainly any types of armour. You really, to penetrate, need to use the point, so it should be stab-centric or thrust-centric fighting style, not all of this slashing that we see. But anyway, let's dive into these fights and see what I think. So first thing to say is the types of knife they were using. I've just grabbed a Bowie knife reconstruction of a 19th century style cut and thrust knife. Can be used as a tool, also used as a weapon, a sidearm, and these knives roughly correspond to something like that. Now obviously it's called the Chris knife, I think everybody knows that about Dune. The Chris, of course, is a completely different weapon, but it is from the Philippines and the rest of Southeast Asia. There's various different types of kris actually. So there is a connection here between the fighting style they've chosen, Filipino martial arts, and the kris knife, although they've disguised the word kris in a different spelling. But fundamentally, it's a cut and thrust knife. To be honest, not very different to your large chef's knife from your kitchen.
May thy knife chip and shatter.
Now, believe it or not, that is actually quite an interesting note. May your knife chip and shatter. The very fact that a knife can chip and shatter, and these are made particularly from teeth of these giant worms, sandworms, that would affect how you use the knives. Okay, so generally speaking, if you knew that the material that your weapon was made from was very brittle, whether it's very hard and brittle steel or whether it's made of some other material that was likely to chip and shatter, you probably wouldn't slash or chop with it very much. Stabbing would be safer, and you would avoid blade-on-blade contact or hitting hard objects like bits of armour, because your blade would be more likely to chip and shatter, so it would affect the fighting style.
You should welcome my blade.
Now you've got to notice here what they're wearing, okay? They are wearing these suits that sustain them, keep them alive, but that is layers of material. And the fact is that cutting through material with a short blade is actually really, really difficult. Most slashes won't get through a winter coat. Stabs will, but slashes won't. So in theory, we shouldn't see a lot of cutting, but as you're going to see, we do.
So.
Right, I'm just going to stop it there for a second. So initially we have seen some thrusts given, but we've seen a lot of cuts. Now, generally speaking, cuts could be more difficult to block because the arm is traversing distance quicker because it's the end of a lever. A thrust moves forward in a straight line. So advantages, disadvantages, clearly the thrust is going to go through their clothing, a cut might not. But a cut might open up opportunities and, to attack into, and might be harder to block. That being said, in terms of how they're standing, is pretty good, and I love the fact that they're using both hands. Now you could, like if you were fencing, you'd have your sword forwards. You could keep one side back, and the advantage of keeping one side forward and one side back is it makes you a narrower target, it brings this shoulder forward, gives you greater reach. So in fencing, we often stand with a very side-on stance. However, in knife fighting, you want to make liberal use of this spare hand here for blocking, grabbing, all this kind of stuff. So the fact that they're switching sides is actually really, really well done, and I like that. So a few things happen there. I really like that he's blocking with his arm. So one of the things with short blades, if we were dealing with swords, often you would parry the opposing blade with your blade. Okay, you would encounter blade on blade. But here the blades are very short, so very often when something comes towards you, you can block the arm, just like you would do in Kung Fu or Karate, something like this. You can block the arm rather than the blade. Obviously you don't want to put your arm against the blade for obvious reasons. But because the weapon's short, you can block the arm without their weapon being able to reach you. So it changes the dynamic slightly. So there's still parrying, like in fencing, but instead of parrying the blade, you parry the arm. And we've seen the use, they've fallen on the ground. Anybody who's seen real fights or CCTV footage or whatever of real fights often do end up on the ground. But here's the big thing, in a weapon fight, you want to get up again quickly, especially because you can reach people on the ground more easily with a weapon because it extends your arm's reach. But you just don't want to be lying on the ground. It's a bad place to be, and certainly if there were multiple opponents, you don't want to end up fighting on the ground. So sorry BJJ people, it's a great martial art, but when knives come into play, you don't want to be spending a lot of time on the floor. Right, let's get back to the fight. Right, okay, so a lot of interesting exchanges here. It kind of looks like basic Kali Eskrima Filipino martial arts because that's what it's based on. I don't have any big problems with it. Some of the movements were kind of exaggerated, but this is typical for movie or theatre because they are, for the audience to understand what's going on, the movements are made bigger. So you don't just cut like this like you would do in reality. You make a bigger motion to tell the story to the viewer. So I'm not going to be overly critical, but just so you, because this is a movie fight review, just so that you're clear about it, the motions are exaggerated for theatrical purposes. And I do like the finishing detail that he's come up there to get a submission essentially on the guy with the edge to the neck, i.e. it's above the clothing. So I've been very critical here, I think, of the slashes not probably really doing much against someone in this clothing or kind of light armour essentially. However, obviously the neck and the head in this case and the hands are exposed, so they would be vulnerable to cuts.
There's no yielding under the Amtal rule. Only death is the test of them.
So I really like these exchanges. They're very like, if you've ever done Wing Chun, the sticky hands drill, or if you've just viewed it, just Google it now. This is very similar to Wing Chun sticky hands, which in itself is very similar to a lot of Filipino martial arts drills, Kali Eskrima, so on, Arnis, so on, so forth. So really, really good, basic Filipino martial arts stuff, looks really cool. However, here's the elephant in the room. It looks a little bit like a training drill in that they are going through these motions and not really moving around very much. So it looks a bit like Patacate Baker's man. They're standing on the spot, bap, 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 bap. Oh, doesn't this look good? We can keep the camera where it is. We don't have to move it around. Real fights aren't really like this, at least none that I've ever seen or even seen footage of. People move around more. They leap around more. They move in, out, and they move backwards and forwards and around. So they're a bit static here, I would say. And in what we do, when we do like Bowie knife dueling, we are lunging in and gathering quickly, leaping out, and we're moving around a lot more. And they're a little bit sticky hand static, like they're doing a drill. So it looks cool, but it also doesn't really look very much like a knife fight to me. Anyway, let's go back to this.
He's toying with him.
So I actually really liked that finish because it was actually, technically speaking, in terms of the technique, really simple, but also something that you see happen even just in sparring, you know, play fighting. So essentially, stab comes in, he parries the stab, traverses past, steps through, which is nice because it goes back to what I was just saying. I didn't like it when they were too static and doing sticky hand stuff. He steps through and stabs the guy, looks like in the kidneys kind of area, as he passes through. And these kind of in and out traversing techniques are actually really, really commonly found in historical fighting manuals and treatises. Whether it's with a sword, a poleaxe, a dagger, it doesn't really matter. It's the general principle of parrying, moving in, and then moving out. And you have to remember, of course, that after you've given your attack, the opponent might stab you back because they're not just instantly, it's not going to be lights out. They are still a weapon-wielding, wounded, dangerous animal. So basically parry, riposte as you go in, traverse out, get to a safe distance, and then look at your handiwork and see if you need to do more. So I actually really like how this fight finished. It wasn't too elaborate, it wasn't outlandish, it was good, solid principles. Why don't we get on to the next fight? So once again, we see the weapon here, and this is somewhat different. So this is essentially a dagger. Okay, there are a few things to note about it. First of all, it doesn't have a crossguard. Now, generally speaking, crossguards, they can get in the way when you're wearing them. It's one of the reasons why a lot of military knives don't have big crossguards on them, but in a fight, a crossguard's super useful. You wouldn't believe the number of times when we're Bowie knife sparring that even though it's a relatively small blade as compared to swords, the the guard actually stops the opponent's blade, especially when you've encountered it with your blade and their blade slides down. The second, so essentially it defends you from things coming downwards, but perhaps even more importantly, it prevents your hand from riding upwards. So one of the reasons something like a Fairbairn Sykes commando dagger, for example, has a guard is to stop the hand sliding up when applied to a resisting target, so to speak. So this doesn't have that, although it does look like it has a grip which is a little bit to give some hand security, but not very much. It is a double-edged, looks symmetrical, cutting on both edges and pointed blade. So it's a cut and thrust blade, but it's not very big. It actually looks about the same size as this. So you can slash with it, you can cut with it. It's not really optimized for it, however. It's clearly designed as a thrusting blade. But let's see, is it mostly used as a thrusting blade or a cutting blade? Let's see. Just to comment on where Paul wears his dagger, wearing something down there is quite a good location, but the fact that it is hilt downwards means it would be incredibly likely to fall out. So generally speaking, in the real world, with bayonets or bowie knives, hunting knives, things like this, if they were ever intended to be worn point downwards, you would need to have, in most cases, some type of clip or retaining feature. So even if it's a Velcro strap or if it's a button that you push in that you find with some bayonets and police swords, for example, you push the button in and it unclips from the bayonet, you'd need to have something like that. I don't know whether this has got that, but just so you know, in the real world you would need that. You couldn't just turn any knife upside down, because while it might stay there by friction alone, as soon as you started running around or doing, climbing up things, or you fell over, it would just fall out and you might fall on it. It'd be pretty bad. But as a location, pretty cool. It's just that usually they are hilt up in that location at the back. So really important to note here for this fight, if we were looking at it from a realistic point of view, that Feyd-Rautha is wearing armour, okay? Now, armour changes everything in a fight, and the way that we use swords, the way that we use poleaxes, spears, daggers, knives, if there's armour involved, we use them in a different way, and you have to bypass the armour. You can't expect to stab through the armour, you have to stab around the armour. And if we look at the medieval and Renaissance combat treatises, swords are used, as I say, in a completely different way to bypass the armour. So the fact that he's wearing armour would greatly change the fight. We'd expect more grappling, but we'd also expect a lot more stabbing around the gaps of the armour. We would also not expect to see any slashing or cuts, because you can't cut through plate armour. You can't cut through mail armour really either. So most types of armour would massively reduce the amount of cutting and increase the amount of thrusting. But let's see what happens.
May thy knife chip and shatter.
Right, I'm going to stop there for a second because there's a few things to mention. So I love the fact that Paul starts in essentially a fencing stance that we call either medium or terse. Position number 2 with the legs, if you're looking at British military sabre. He's in a good fencing stance, but he has the left hand ready. So he is sideways on, he is making himself a narrow target, but the left hand's still here. And we see very early on in the fight, he makes extensive use of the left hand in blocking. This first exchange was beautifully choreographed. I really liked it. And I have to say, it actually, to me, looked more like Western fencing than Filipino martial arts. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I do think it suits these particular weapons. So let's go back a little bit, and there we go. Let's just go back a little bit here, and let's see that again.
Shatter.
Right, I'll stop at the same point again. There are some slashes in there. Now, I would say they're for theatrical purposes, partly because this is based on Filipino martial arts, which has lots of cutting. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, in the Philippines, most of the knife fighting styles are designed to be used against people not wearing anything or not wearing much at all, okay? This isn't particularly very well adapted to fighting in armour. Okay, if we look at European, medieval and Renaissance dagger fighting, that's adapted to fighting people wearing heavy clothing or armour like this. And it doesn't look very much like Filipino martial arts. So this kind of slashing is great, looks great on screen, it's easier for the audience to read, it looks nice and flashy, and against people who are wearing just a t-shirt or less, works great with a large bladed knife. Not really that well suited to this particular style of combat. Anyway, let's see how it goes on. Right, grabbing, wrapping, arm wraps. So when you come very close, wrapping the arm, very, very applicable, found in all martial arts using blades. The uses of knees, kicks, headbutts, elbows, punches, any of these things, biting, eye gouging, all of these things completely applicable. And I love the fact that they have fitted them into this. It's not like a clean, clinical Olympic fencing style back and forth. They have made it look like an actual fight, which is really, really good. Let's carry on. Right, I love the fact a thrust comes, it was aimed a little bit high, I think. So generally speaking, if you aim at this height and someone pushes upwards, it's going to miss. If you aim at this height and they push upwards, it's still going to catch them. So I would say their attack was aimed, Paul's attack was aimed a little bit high, but I love the fact that at least they are doing proper extended thrusts and lunges. Really, really good, and that's what we would expect to see with these types of knife and these types of armour and equipment. Let's carry on. Right, I love the fact that there was a kick as a block in there. Now that is a bit outlandish, but from an entertainment point of view, absolutely fantastic. We'll go back and look at that again in a second, but also he then stops a blade with a blade. Now you might think I'm going to say that that's outlandish, but actually it happens a surprising amount with this sort of blade knife. So using it like a miniature sword to block an incoming sword. It's done in Filipino martial arts, but it's also done in European martial arts, and daggers absolutely are used, sometimes gripping them like that, but sometimes singular to block an incoming blade. Perfectly historical, and I really, really like it. So let's go back a little bit and we can see that exchange again. I'll just stop there again. I also just noticed there's a turning, after the grab, there's a turn of the hand. And this is also a way that can lead to either an armbar. So if you've grabbed someone's arm and twisted it, you can now apply your other hand to their elbow, barring the arm out, and break the arm. The other guy counters. This is actually incredibly complex, way more than I was expecting, now that I'm breaking it down piece by piece. And after the twist, he goes for it, but the other guy twists out because you twist out of the armbar. There are other things you can do from there, like disarms, but it's not so easy when you've got a knife in your hand. Anyway, let's carry on with the fight. Oh, I wasn't a big fan of that slash, slash, boom. I mean, unless it's a way of creating an opening. So if I was being charitable, what I would kind of explain this away with here is to say that Federatha is basically going slash slash to get Paul's arms up so that he's opening him for the lower stab. And in fairness, that is what he does. But generally speaking, just so you know, these slashes, unless they were done at the face or neck, they're not really probably going to do much at all to his clothes. Let's just go back a little bit and see that again. So quite a lot to digest in that exchange. There is a lot of moves. These guys must have practiced this for so long. There is a lot of slashing, and actually, although it looks like a lot of kind of fight moves and techniques in there, a lot of that is actually quite repetitive. So there's a lot of slash, slash, stab, slash, slash, stab, it looks like, which is often what you do with choreography because it makes it easier for the actors to remember and practice and do it safely. And of course, you get more material for the editor to work with. So you stretch the fight out. Everything I said before, the slashes wouldn't work very well against the clothed areas, but I guess they would work against the head and face, and they are a way of drawing the opponent's defences up to open them for a stab somewhere else. Let's carry on. So controversial leg sweep there, but actually it was beautifully choreographed. And yeah, why wouldn't it work? Absolutely. Some people go, oh, you never turn your back on an opponent. There are loads of martial arts where you turn your back on an opponent, and I can show you fencing treatises from across the centuries where occasionally they turn the back on the opponent to do a specific technique in a specific context. And this is fun, and it was done really, really nicely. Let's watch that again, actually, because it was so fun to watch. Oh, a little detail there. So he goes to stab him on the ground, and Paul defends, boom, foot up. Now, I recently watched some BJJ guys defending against simulated knife attacks, and they were doing exactly this. So you can keep someone at bay by lying on your back. Now, I know I say you don't want to be on the ground in a knife fight. You don't generally. And I wouldn't advise it. However, if you do find yourself on the ground, yes, you can kick a person away, and hopefully buy enough time and space that you can get back up on your feet again, which is exactly what Paul does. So you don't stay on the ground. You don't just lie on the ground and kick, because you're never going to win the fight that way. But you can stave someone off long enough to get back up on your feet, which is what he does. Now that was a proper kind of like kung fu movie flip over. And do you know what? I love kung fu movies. I enjoyed that. It was very outlandish, very silly, but very good fun. Let's just rewind a little bit and see that again. A kick, yeah, and you know, a kick has a long reach, especially well applied. A side kick like that, or a back kick, can have more reach than an arm with a stab. So absolutely we see kicks in fact, if you look at Marozzo from 1536, he has kicks against knife attacks. And you find it later on as well in some of the Dutch 17th century stuff. So yeah, absolutely cool stuff. Let's carry on. So just to pause there for a second, so we actually saw a flurry of attacks, and some of them were thrusts or stabs, some of them were slashes. As you know by now, I'm not a fan of the slashes, especially against Vader Alpha, because he's wearing clearly armour, essentially. Let's just call it armour, because it is. Those slashes not going to do anything. But one nice detail I liked there was one where I think Paul's cut did actually make contact, and it made a noise. I don't know if this was intentional or accidental, but it made a noise that sounded like the edge scratching across the armour, which is exactly what would happen. It wouldn't cut through the armour, it wouldn't cut Vader Alpha, it would scratch across the plate. So why do it? It's just a wasted movement. If you've got the opening to be able to do this, why not turn your hand around that way and apply the point? So in my view, he could have finished the fight here. He could have stabbed Vader Alpha, but he didn't. Anyway, let's carry on with this fight. Right, okay, I'm just going to rewind that bit. This is a really important technique, and it is also really historical. Let's have a look at this again. Right, okay, so that technique where you bend someone's arm, so I talked about arm bars before, so if someone's arm is out straight, you overextend it and you hit into the elbow or push into the elbow from that side, so you exploit the fact that the arm's straight. If the arm's bent, you do the opposite and you twist it in various ways. Now, I've only got two arms, so I can't demonstrate this without a training partner, but there is something we call a figure four arm lock, and that's what he does here. Now, he does a lower version of it, which is a little bit like what we call a ligadura satana from Fiore de Liberi's treatise. If it was an upper version, it would be either a ligadura soprana, or there's another version which goes round this way in front of the body, which is ligadura mezzana. So ligadura means binding or lock, arm lock essentially, and this is I think some martial arts call it a figure four arm lock. So he does a figure four arm lock and then drives Paul's own dagger into his body. Okay, and this is absolutely found in historical treatises. We can find this in Fiore, for example, which is the main one that I teach from, but you can find it in numerous other treatises and manuals as well. So manipulating someone's arm in such a way that you twist and lock it and then drive their own knife into their own body, great. And I absolutely love seeing it here. It's so cool, and it was really well executed, really well done, looked really, really convincing. I loved it. Right, so blade grabbing. Now, I understand that some people will probably find this controversial. I, however, do not. The reason I don't find it controversial is not just because I've watched Rob Roy, and Rob Roy did exactly the same thing in his Duel, which I've looked at in the past on my channel. Maybe we'll look at that again, actually, if there's an appetite for me to review any fights in Rob Roy, or any other movies, incidentally. Get posting down below with your suggestions, they're very welcome. But not only can you grab blades, not only do people grab blades in modern crime and things like this, but it is also taught in numerous martial arts and historical treatises and manuals. It's completely normal and completely done. Now, often we're looking at the blade grabs on things like this small sword blade, but it's also done occasionally with long swords and arming swords and rapiers and various other types of sword. It's not done very much in Filipino martial arts, as much as I have seen, but it's done a lot in European. Grabbing a blade, especially if you've got a leather glove. Now, the thing to mention is that leather sticks to steel quite well. So leather, although leather can be cut through, obviously it gives you another layer of thicker skin against the edges. But here's the big picture, people. Would you rather be stabbed in the chest, or would you rather get cut in the hand? If it's a straight up choice between those two things, clearly cut in the hand. Now, if you can grab a blade and it prevents from going into your body somewhere in a vital target, then you grab the blade, and it's what people instinctively do. And these very often people get defensive wounds on their forearms and hands from doing exactly this, because the brain and nature, evolution has taught us to do this. Grab the thing that you don't want stuck in your body. So not only what Paul Atreides does is kind of instinctive and plausible, but it is also the right thing to do in this situation. He's disarmed. His own knife is stuck in his body. He grabs the opponent's, and now what happens next is Feyd-Rautha pushes it through his hand. Now, I actually don't think this is very likely. If you grab a blade securely and keep a very tight hold of it, especially with leather gloves, and leather tends to stick to steel, then I think that it's more likely that Paul's arm would collapse and he could still push the dagger in. And there's a technique called più fortezza, maybe I'll deal with that in a future video, where you actually push from behind as a counter, and that's what Feyd-Rautha should have done. That would have been the counter to this technique. He doesn't do it. But the blade slides in the hand. Now, that's what you don't want, because blades cut when they saw or slide. They either pushing or pulling. So you don't want that. But that is what happens here. But let's see what happens next. And there we go. And that was actually the right thing to do. So having grabbed the blade here, that is being pushed towards you there, all you need to do is divert and we don't really see exactly how he does it. You could potentially do it just with the left hand, but you've got a spare right hand. So the correct way to do it would be, if I grab, hold on, let's do it carefully with this blade because this is sharp. If you're holding it here, what you do is you take your other hand here and push sideways. And because Feyd-Rautha is only holding his knife with one hand at this point, he's only got 1 point of leverage, you put 2 points of leverage and you turn it towards them and then push into them. So this is, again, a historical technique, completely valid, completely plausible. And I absolutely love that this is how this fight ended. And in fact, you know, the old adage, or if you go in a knife fight, you're gonna get cut. And there's many videos talking about why that's not the right mentality to go in with. But this, the fact that they both got stabbed, is how a lot of duels with small swords ended, and rapiers, incidentally. So lots of duels, unlike in Hollywood, did end up, real world duels, whether it's with a knife, a small sword, a rapier, saber, whatever, ended up with both people being quite badly wounded, just that one was a lot worse wounded than the other. So overall, did I like these fights? Yes, I loved them. They were amazing entertainment, fantastically shot. They could have done with better lighting in the second fight. It was a little bit dark and a little bit difficult to tell what was going on some of the time. In fact, that's true of the first fight as well, actually, given that it was outdoors. It was sort of dusk, I think. But anyway, better lighting would have been nicer. But overall, the choreography was amazing. The actors did amazing. There was too much slashing. Slashing's pointless at armor or thick clothing, not enough thrusting, but I understand why they did it for dramatic effect. Overall, this was a solid sort of 8 out of 10, I would say. Very, very good. Some of the best weapon-based fight choreography I've seen in movies, but I'm sure you know others. So if you've got others to suggest, get posting down below. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. There are many more like it on my channel. I've got a whole playlist of movie fight reviews going back years. I'm welcome to other suggestions. So as I say, get posting down below for other fights you want me to have a look at on screen. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks.